Hi everybody and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about biological and biosocial theories of crime. And so we're moving on away from this kind of classical school of criminology with the idea that crime is a choice and moving on to other kind of theories of crime. And the first one we're going to talk about is biological theories. So classical criminology kind of gave way to this idea of biological positivism in the late 1800s. Basically, the idea that your genetics and your biology might actually make up some part of your criminal propensity, right? And so the basic idea here is that crime may take place due to some inborn abnormalities. And there are physical traits that index specific makeups that lead to crime. And so, again, when we start looking at these biology, right, with the advent of biology, studying genetics and genes in the 1800s, people said, well, wait a minute, this may relate to crime as well. And there's this idea that, people are born with blue eyes, they're born with blonde hair, and it stays consistent throughout life. Maybe real criminals are born with traits that make them criminal. Of course, one of the problems is no law can really affect the innate makeup of a person, but that may explain also why laws aren't working to stop crime from happening, right? So the father of biological criminology's name is Cesare Lombroso, and Lombrosian criminology is very, very famous in criminology. Everyone pretty much knows about this. But Lombroso is really kind of considered this father of biological criminology, and he compared physical traits of Italian soldiers to Italian criminals and came up to some conclusions here, right? Criminals were physically different from law-abiding people. And these differences demonstrated a biological cause for crime, right? He took a bunch of Italian soldiers, did a bunch of different measurements, and then took a bunch of criminals, did a bunch of different measurements, and found there are these kind of basic differences between the two groups. Now, there is kind of a research methods issue here, right? Hopefully something is jumping out to you on this slide that for research methods you say, whoa, 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 this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? And if you notice that the comparison group of soldiers to criminals seems suspect, well, that's exactly right. Especially back in the 1870s, how were wars fought? Yeah, they were fought with guns to an extent, right? And cannons, but they also relied quite a bit on hand-to-hand combat, which means what made a really, really good soldier? Someone typically who was fairly big and strong because there was some hand-to-hand nature to combat then, right? You compare that to criminals. Lombroso got all these criminals from prisons. And so, number one, we're assuming that everyone he measured was in fact guilty of some sort of crime, right? We know that there's no guarantee that that is necessarily true just because you're in prison. But notwithstanding, also prisons back in the day were not like prisons are today. Not that prisons today are necessarily significantly better, but back in the 1800s, if you went to prison, you did not eat a lot. You did not have access to regular exercise a lot. And so you might just naturally be frail and smaller from being malnourished in a prison compared to soldiers that the best soldiers were these big, strong guys, right? So that's kind of a tangent here, but there's already a research methods issue that we should hopefully be identifying here based on his quote-unquote scientific study of criminals. So basically what he determined was that these criminals were what he referred to as atavisms, which is just basically a throwback to an earlier stage of human evolution, right? So these atavistic throwbacks had physical makeup, mental capacities, and instincts like primitive man, and they're unfit for civilized life, right? Almost to an extent, you could look at these atavisms almost kind of like a missing link of sorts in evolutionary chains. They couldn't help but be criminal, according to Lombroso. And specifically, there were visible stigmata that made it very clear that these people were criminals, right? Some of these things could be asymmetry of the head, monkey-like ears, large lips, receding and twisted chin, long arms, right? The interesting thing is that men had to have 5 or more visible stigmata to be viewed a criminal, and women only had to have 3. I want you to stop and think for a second as to why that might be. We're going to go through a couple more slides and I'm going to answer that question. But I want you to be thinking, why is it that you think that men had to have more stigmata than women did? So I know you all are dying to see pictures of what an atavistic throwback is, or someone who's not nearly as advanced as sophisticated society. Pretty much every FSU fan you've ever met. I'm just kidding, right? This is just a joke. But this next slide that you're going to see does have, if you Google visible stigmata or atavism, this is what shows up in Google. Here it is. You see kind of an asymmetry of the face, a long chin, a kind of messed up nose, bigger ears, right? And you see that this person, if you walked by this person on the street and you found out they were a criminal, you'd probably say, yeah, I can see it, right? That kind of makes sense. So because of Lombroso and because he was using biology, he was using this newfound science, measurement of features became commonplace in criminal identification. We started immediately measuring people to see who could be the possible criminals. Now, the theory explained more male features compared to female features. And I asked you a couple slides before why you think that might be. Well, the answer is Lombroso suggested that if women had too many of these features, they would be far too unattractive, and therefore men would not procreate with them, would not sleep with them to have kids because they were too ugly, and so their genes would their crime gene that they had, or their crime biology that they had, would just kind of die away because they never got married. Kind of sexist, right? View that Lombroso here had. But Lombroso had a problem. As crime kept happening, people started realizing, wait a minute, some of these people don't really look like these atavisms that Lombroso was talking about. So that forced Lombroso to identify two other types. The insane criminal, which is someone who's mentally ill, right? We know these people kind of as psychopaths now, or any form of other names, that just kind of does insane, kind of crazy stuff, but doesn't have these stigmata. And then also the criminaloid. The criminaloid is something a little bit more kind of like you would imagine Ted Bundy, right? A good-looking guy that's just kind of looks like a normal everyday person in society, but is also in fact a criminal. So because of some of these issues that Lombroso had, more people started to do work on this and looking to see, like, let's look and see if criminals are in fact biologically inferior to other people. So Goring largely disproved Lombroso's work quite a bit. But he did find significant differences between criminals and law-abiding citizens based on height and weight. So it's like, well, maybe there is something going on here. So that pushed Hooton to do some research, and he found Goring's work deficient, but said that criminals are organically inferior, right? So yeah, Goring's work was not very good. He still had quite a bit of bias, but he still thought there was some sort of organically inferior nature to criminals because of this idea of biological determinism, right? And we've already kind of touched on that in an earlier slide, this idea of biological determinism. But basically what that means is that your biology is predicting your behavior, right? And so if you have a certain biology that's bad, your behavior is therefore going to be bad also. Hooton also had some pretty serious methodological issues in studying this as well. However, even with all these different methodological issues, all early biological theories had the basic kind of common threads, right? They had similar factors. They all viewed the environment as largely incidental. The environment didn't matter. Criminals were born, criminals were not made. In kind of a nature versus nurture debate, they geared more toward what? Nature, right? Your biology makes you different than other people, right? Criminals are inherently different than non-criminals. Well, as I hope you guys have determined, by the 1950s, pretty much all biological theories have been discredited. They're super racist and sexist, and they really promoted some pretty horrific policies, if you think about it, right? If there's nothing we can do to stop a criminal from being criminal, what are the only real policies? Is locking them in prison going to do anything? Not really. Are giving them fines going to do anything? Not really, right? The only policies are eugenics, right, which means castrate them, don't let them procreate. If we get rid of all the criminals and they can't procreate, well, problem solved. Exclusion, kick them out of society, send them off to some sort of penal colony somewhere, or, and this one's not listed, but or execution, right? We might as well just kill them because as long as they're alive, they're going to continue committing deviance. The theories overwhelmingly have over time been viewed as way too simplistic. They are super untestable, and they're really based on more ideological biases than anything else. Even if you think about some of the visible stigmata they talked about, some of the ideas are actually kind of pretty race specific. They're just describing other races, right? And which is why they're racist. But they're also untestable because how do we know the person's a criminal? Well, they committed a crime. Why did they commit a crime? Because they have these features, right? We're only using criminals to tell us. What if I had long arms, a twisted chin, and large lips, but didn't commit a crime? How do you justify that, right? There's no real good way to do that. So strict biological determinism was abandoned and as newer research emerged, right? And it focused on biological variables in conjunction with other social variables, right? Ignore the phone in the background. I don't really know why that's ringing. It always makes me nervous when my phone rings in my office. So modern biosocial theory is one of the most popular theories, or the perspective is one of the most popular theoretical perspectives among criminologists. And the main proposition is that behavior results from the interaction of biology and the environment, right? So there's this gene by environment interaction that's taking place to get certain kind of behaviors, right? However, I want to caution you, this does not claim to be that there is a crime gene or preordained criminality at all. All this suggests is that there is a genetic predisposition to be sensitive to environmental stimuli that may be related to criminality. All right, that's why the term is biosocial, not biological. Now, what does this mean? There are certain environmental factors that can predict deviance, right? I'm right now this semester teaching a class in family violence, right? There are certain things that can happen in your environment. Like if you are a victim of a crime, you are more likely to be a criminal, right? So your genetics can predispose you to be more sensitive to that stimuli. But it can also work the other way around, right? The basic idea here is if you are in a very, very antisocial environment and you have this genetic predisposition toward crime, you are going to be significantly more criminal than someone who doesn't have this genetic predisposition, right? But the opposite of that is true also. If you have this genetic predisposition toward to be sensitive to your environment and you're in a very, very pro-social environment, then you might actually go on to be a surgeon or the next Bill Gates or something else, right? Where you can actually achieve a tremendous level of greatness because you are so sensitive to those environmental stimuli pushing you toward greatness. All this theory suggests is that your biology may play a role, but not necessarily in criminality in and of itself, but just to be sensitive to environmental cues. So there are some neurobiological approaches to crime, right? Your biochemistry has been examined, right? Testosterone has really weak to no relationship with criminal offending. Neurophysiology or mental functioning, right? IQ and delinquent behavior, there's weak to moderate support that IQ is related. Verbal ability and visual motor integration may be related. And this is where we kind of see this life course persistent versus adolescent limited idea in criminality, right? Adolescent limited, meaning that most adolescents are deviant but kind of age out of it by the time they're 19, 20, 21, whereas life course persistent is you kind of peak in adolescence and just plateau at adolescence and stay criminal your entire life, right? There's also some neurophysiological things like your autonomic nervous system functioning and arousal. If you have slower arousal and reaction time to stimuli, you may have higher crime rates. Obviously, crime is viewed as more arousing than not committing crime. However, it doesn't really explain why you choose crime, not pro-social arousing events like skydiving or scuba diving or surfing, right? There's other kind of adrenaline junkies. Adrenaline junkies have slower arousal times also, but they choose to do things other than crime. So why are some people choosing crime and some people not? There's also an idea of right hemisphere dysfunction, which may lead to low resting heart rates, which may lead to involvement in crime, and there's a fairly robust relationship there, but not every criminal has this right hemisphere dysfunction. Behavioral genetics have also been used to explain crime, and this is the interplay of specific genes and environment, right? Crime could depend on shared and non-shared environments, and so behavioral genetics kind of influence your behavioral reactions to environments. So if you think about it, right, there are a lot of differences within families, even as far as deviance, right? For those of you who have had me in the past, you know that I always talk about my stepbrother who is rather deviant, sticking pizza down his pants and stuff. Well, I don't know if he does it anymore, but he used to at least stick like pizza and stuff down his pants from Walmart or Publix and take it home. I guess that was kind of the preheat function in his pants before he got it home to cook it and eat it. And so this is all frozen pizza, not warm pizza, just to clarify. We grew up, though, in very shared environments, but we had a significant enough non-shared environment to where my stepbrother was pulled more toward deviance, and I clearly was pulled more toward getting a PhD and being your professor. And so using behavioral genetics, now granted also this is a bad example because he's my stepbrother, we don't share any genetic material at all, but if it wasn't my stepbrother, let's say it was my brother, right, you could see, well, we have the same genes, what's the difference here, right? One of the best ways to study this is through adoption studies, right? And adoption studies are able to show differences between genes and environment. And so children whose father and adopted father were criminals were more likely to be criminal, right? And that's interesting. However, what we see is if the dad is criminal and the adopted dad is not criminal, kids typically are still more likely to be criminal. And if the dad is non-criminal but the adopted dad is criminal, kids are more likely to not be criminal, right? Now, this is very interesting. However, Gottfredson and Hershey in A General Theory of Crime, which they published in 1990, found some serious flaws in the research design to where these studies have really been called into question. Twin studies also allow tests of genetic susceptibility, right? There's a ton of assumptions in these studies, though, which obviously makes it difficult to say for sure if they're accurate or not. And they combine genetics with the quote-unquote contagious nature of antisocial behavior. Obviously, right, you'll hear this in church and you'll hear this in criminology classes. Crime or sin is fun to do. People feel good when they're committing crime or when they're committing sin. Otherwise, no one would do it, right? We wouldn't have to stop people from committing crime if it didn't feel good. So there's this contagious nature of antisocial behavior. So when controlling for common environments in juveniles, the genetics pretty much almost disappears, right? However, there's strong criticism of the use of heritability and how they controlled for all of these, studies and a lot of these assumptions that make these tests also somewhat problematic. What this has led to is specific gene research being a potentially better avenue to study. So there's things like DRD2 and DAT1. These are not Star Wars characters. These are actually repeated measure alleles associated with deviance in certain environments. And they show a propensity toward criminality, right? You may be pushed toward criminality some way. However, when controlling for things like peer association, the relationship is not nearly as strong. And so there seems to be this genetic link with genes. However, potentially there's still a stronger environmental factor. Even in evolutionary psychology, there suggests that crime might happen to spread DNA. So for example, rape. The reason why men commit rape, specifically men commit rape significantly at higher rates than women do, is because they're trying to spread their DNA as much as possible. And there's this idea in evolutionary psychology of cads versus dads, where cads, you could view them as more quantitative. I need to reproduce, and I need to make sure that my genetics are passed on. And so I'm going to sleep with as many people as possible and have as many kids as possible. And hopefully 2 or 3 of those will grow up and be able to spread their seed, right? Let's just kind of shotgun it, just throw a lot out there and hope something sticks, right? Whereas dads are more qualitative. I want my genes to reproduce. I'm really invested in making sure my genetics are passed on. So I'm only going to have 1 or 2 kids, but I'm going to pour myself into them entirely, right? Cads impregnate someone and move on. Dads impregnate someone, stay with them, raise their kids, and really spend a lot of time nurturing that 1 specific child or 2 specific children to make sure they grow up so their genes can be spread also. Of course, there's a huge problem here with tautology, and this is super untestable, and it really also, there's a scope issue because this really only kind of explains 1 crime. It also explains a lot more male versus female crime than male A versus male B crime. A lot of male rape is male on male rape. There is no chance, right? 10 out of 10 men that have sex with other men are not going to get pregnant, right? It just genetically or biologically cannot happen. And so there's some pretty big issues with this general idea also in explaining male versus male crime. And it has kind of similar issues in logic as Lombroso and just largely isn't accepted today in criminology. So the empirical support is uncertain or weak at best. And this is in large part due to the large number of theories present, but also because the methodology is terrible, the sampling is terrible, and the measurement is terrible, right? We're not doing good research. And as we always say, bad data yields bad results, right? Bad methods yield bad results. And so if you don't do the study properly, the results are largely useless. And so molecular genetics have better empirical support, but still there are some problems. For the deterministic biological theories, the policy implications are also really scary and really brutal, right? Sterilization, euthanasia, less welfare, selective breeding even, and government reservations of criminals have all been policies that have been implemented based on these theoretical orientation. With the more gene by environment interactive ones, the policies are much more rehabilitative, right? The idea is we can't change your genes, but we can change your environment. So let's get you into more pro-social environments. If you are sensitive to your environment, let's get you around people that are going to push you to want to study and push you to want to be great. And these are very, very similar policies that other theories recommend as well. So I hope you guys all enjoyed this. Again, make sure you're reading in the book because this is just an overview of the biological theories. And there's a lot more really good information in the book. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know.